Yes, I can. I hope you can hear me too.
Yes, I can confirm that we hear you loud and clear, and you are very visible in the audience. So, Professor Cyril is a professor of ecclesiology, international relations, and ecumenism at St. Ignatius College, University College, Stockholm, and also a director of the Huffington Ecumenical Institute at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. So he operates in different continents, and I assume that none of these mentioned continents is one that you are located at the moment. Is it so that you are somewhere else?
Yes, I'm in Colombia now, in the
Colombia,
Andes.
yeah.
Yes, 200 meters
Okay.
above the sea level.
Yes. So, Professor Cyril has published an impressive number of studies examining the positions, activities, and aspirations of the Orthodox churches. And in recent years, the central themes of his research have been ecclesiology and the social and political influence of the Orthodox churches. Professor Hoverun has visited Joensuu on several occasions, but today he is participating in our conference remotely. Professor Hoverun, you are very welcome. I wave to you from Joensuu and express my gratefulness to have the opportunity to hear your keynote presentation, Orthodox Political Theologies in the 20th Century. Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Pekka. Well, greetings to everyone, and also apologies for not being able to be with you in person. I just, as I said, I'm in Colombia, and I just had a presentation at another university, the University of Andes in Bogota, and could not make it to Joensuu by the time of the conference. I'm going to speak about the Orthodox political theology. I would add to the title that was announced by Pekka, in the long 20th century, because I think there is the Orthodox political theology developed as a kind of block, and it developed as a block, started developing before the 20th century, and it continues developing to our days, and probably I would bracket the long 20th century in the terms of Orthodox political theology, starting probably with the decade of 1860s, 70s, rather 70s, 80s maybe, 1870s, 80s, and would the other side, the ending side of this bracket, I would place in February 2022, when the big war of Russia against Ukraine started, and it actually somehow ended the long 20th century for the Orthodox churches and for the Orthodox political theology. Let me share with you my presentation, and I will walk you through the stages of the evolution of the Orthodox political theology in this long 20th century with the assistance of the presentation. So here it is, and I hope you can see it, right?
Yes, we can see.
Oh, excuse me. Well, yes, so speaking about the long 20th century again, I would, as I said, I would start it with in the decade of 1870s, 1880s, with the activities of Vladimir Solovyov, whom you see on your left. Solovyov died in the year 1900, exactly the year when the 20th century began, or rather the 19th century ended. And he started the long 20th century, basically, even though he did not live into the 20th century. He started the 20th century with some very radical rethinking of the old patterns of the political theology. Before him, political theology, which existed in the Orthodox milieu, which existed in the East, and I would argue, moreover, that Orthodox political theology was the original one. All other Western examples of political theology just copied or elaborated on the insights of the original Eastern theology. I would argue that, like in many other things, the Westerners copied the Eastern patterns when it comes to theology. It applies, for example, to scholasticism, even though we believe, most of us believe, that scholasticism was born in the West and it's a Western design, and that's why it's very unorthodox. That was primarily the belief of Father George Florovsky, of whom I will be talking today in the context of political theology. But I think he was wrong, because scholasticism was born in the East, at least in the beginning of the 4th century, instigated by the Arian controversies and the Council of Nicaea, which we celebrate this year in a particular way. The same applies to political theology, even though many Orthodox believe that political theology was a completely Western design. Such was, for example, the belief of late Christos Yanaras. Just like Florovsky believed that scholasticism is a Western design, so Yanaras believed that political theology is a Western design, and therefore is not applicable, there is no space for political theology in the Orthodox theology. And again, I believe he was wrong, just like Father George Florovsky was wrong speaking about scholasticism. And I would say that Eastern political theology predated the Western political theology. The father of the Western political theology is believed to be Augustine, and I believe the father of the Eastern political theology was at least Eusebius of Caesarea. And the Eastern political theology from Eusebius, from the time of Eusebius, before and through the time of Vladimir Solovyov, developed along the imperial patterns, more or less. It was very intrinsically connected with the imperial frameworks. It was imperial. We could say that the Orthodox political theology was imperial. It was symphonic. It embodied the principles of the symphony, this idealistic perception that there could be harmonious relations between the church and the state, that most Orthodox upheld until modernity, and still uphold even now in our days, and still think in the imperial terms. And moreover, I would say that we are experiencing now a revival of the imperial political theology. But Solovyov changed it. When Solovyov came to the scene of theology, even though he did not identify himself as a theologian, as we know, but he was more a philosopher, but he was also a political philosopher or political theologian. He basically introduced the principle of human agency, of human freedom, as very important for the social and political processes. This was a step away, a significant, I would say, a quantum leap from the imperial patterns of thinking to more democratic, or I would say even liberal, progressive patterns of thinking, which he brought to the realm of the Orthodox theology. Even further, this leap was made by Nicholas Berdyaev, whom you see on your right, born in Kiev, by the way, and probably adopting some Kievan spirit of freedom. He became a preacher of freedom par excellence. He made freedom like the most important category of theology, of philosophy, and political theology. The activities, they're kind of, even though they were more philosophers, they were not less theologians, even though they were like theologizing philosophers or philosophizing theologians, whatever you prefer. They did not really contribute to political theology as such. They contributed to political theology, but we can sort of reconstruct political theology on the basis of their philosophical insights. The one who came much closer to developing political theology as a discipline was Father Sergei Bulgakov. He also followed the line of Solovyov and Berdyaev when it comes to the importance of human agency and human freedom. He also developed a sort of theology that envisaged separation between the church and the state, and he argued that it's better for the church to stay away from the state than to be with the state. In this sense, his political theology was quite asymphonic, sometimes even anti-symphonic. He was also a secretary of the Council of Moscow, the local council of the Russian Orthodox Church, which happened in this very short period of relative freedom of Russia and Russian Church between the February and October Revolution 1917. This very short period when the Russian Republic actually existed and was really a sort of a republic, was close to be a real republic and not just an imitation of republic as it would happen later on under the Soviets, under the communist regime. So in this very short period of time, several months really, the Russian Orthodox Church managed to convene its council, which became a landmark in the history of the Russian Church, and Bulgakov was a secretary of that council. And he took the spirit of the council, which was basically the spirit of aggiornamento, what we call aggiornamento. You know, this term was applied to Vatican II, the council that tried to update theology, to update the mission of the church to the realities of the modern life. And I think the aggiornamento before Vatican II, there was the Orthodox aggiornamento before the Vatican II aggiornamento, and was embodied exactly in the spirit and decisions of the Moscow Council 1917-1918. And Bulgakov also continued this spirit, embodied this spirit in his own writings, including political, theological writings. This spirit of aggiornamento of the Moscow Council, 1917-18, I would say became embodied in a sort of political theology which I call the political theology of the 1920s. Those roaring 20s, known through the works of Fitzgerald, and it's almost like jazz era in the Orthodox political theology. So there was like a jazz political theology at the time, or the political theology of the 1920s for more conservative audience. So this political theology was marked by the stressing of human freedom, human agency, the importance of human agency, the stressing of the human element in the church. Therefore, this political theology also stemmed from a sort of ecclesiology that was evolving in this period of time, and this ecclesiology envisaged a very important and valued human participation in the life of the church, including the social and political dimensions of the church. It also marked the emancipation of the church from the imperial patterns, given especially that a decade before most empires where the sizable Orthodox populations existed had collapsed. It applied, of course, to the Russian Empire that collapsed in 1917. It applied to the Ottoman Empire that collapsed also in the same period of time and moved to the Republic of Atatürk. It collapsed in the case of the Habsburg Empire, where also some Orthodox populations, especially in the Balkans, lived and acted actively. So the Orthodox experienced this kind of this collapse of the empires, and it urged them to rethink their church and their theology in non-imperial terms. So Bulgakov was the one who basically made a major contribution to this rethinking. In the same period of time, the Ecumenical Patriarchate experienced its own aggiornamento. Even though it did not have its own council, similar to the Council of Moscow, it had some prominent hierarchs like Meletios Metaxakis, a very controversial patriarch. He is not liked by many Orthodox, I know, but he actually had his own political theology, which is quite remarkable, I believe. This political theology amalgamated some important patriarchal documents, like, for example, a patriarchal encyclical published in 1920, which marked also the ecumenical era and the early participation, early stepping in of the Orthodoxy into the ecumenical movement that began just a decade before. So I would say that, well, this political theology of the 1920s had prominent voices like, for example, Father Sergei Bulgakov's, even though he lived even after the 1920s, but he continued this spirit of the theology of the 1920s until he passed away in the 40s. And then in the encyclical of the Ecumenical Patriarchy, the decisions of the Moscow Council 1917-18 and so forth. At the same time, a new trend in political theology began emerging, which was more conservative, which was more revisionist, and I would say that one of the key figures of this new trend in the Orthodox political theology, which I call the Orthodox political theology of the 1930s, was Father George Florovsky. Well, Florovsky usually did not speak about himself as a political theologian. He avoided such a definition. And by the way, political theology at the time of the 1930s, in the time of Florovsky, had been articulated by Carl Schmitt, for example, in Germany, a very remote figure for any Orthodox milieu. And Florovsky was demonstratively apolitical or anti-political. However, I think it was more a camouflage, because I consider him a key figure, a towering figure in the Orthodox political theology, a figure that amalgamated the spirit of the 1930s, a sort of conservative revisionist spirit. And his well, he started in Eurasian movement, as you know. Of course, he denounced the Eurasian movement later on, but he instead suggested a new project, which he called neopatristic synthesis. Neopatristic synthesis, in my judgment, is nothing else but a sort of political theology, and this is a sort of political theology that captures the spirit of the 1930s. So the spirit of the 1930s was more conservative, was more revisionist, was more about the past than about the future, even though Florovsky was not completely about the past. He was really a very broad figure that encompassed many trends. But the tendency, the vector of his theology was more towards conservatism, certainly, which made him so a heroic figure in many circles in the Orthodoxy, even in our time. The spirit also relied very much on the idea of Byzantium and envisaged a sort of revival of Byzantinism. Nicolae Iorga, a famous Romanian Byzantinologist and theologian, who also was a prime minister of the country and a leader of kind of semi-fascist party, a conservative party in Romania, he expressed this spirit by his famous phrase, which he used to title his book, Byzance après Byzance, Byzantium after Byzantium. So basically, the political theology of the 30s tried to build Byzance après Byzance, Byzantium after Byzantium. It tried to create its own Orthodox civilization in contrast to the Western civilization. Therefore, it became very anti-Western, and in the very radical forms, because this kind of anti-Western or conservative trend within the Orthodox political theology had moderate representatives like Florovsky, but also had some radical representatives that went even further beyond Florovsky, like, for example, Nikifor Krajnik, also a prominent theologian, a Romanian theologian, who was born in Chisinau, what is now the Republic of Moldova, and was, I think, a professor there. And he represented a very radical form of this political theology, Orthodox political theology of the 30s. Well, he basically became a fascist, and he supported the regimes of the Iron Guard in Romania, supported all the dictatorships of King Carol the second, of Antonescu, and so forth. And his political theology is basically, well, a fascist theology, political theology. Well, there is a revival of interest to this figure in modern Romania, certainly, and it's interesting that he also wrote on spiritual matters. Like I think he prologued the publication of Father Lev Gillet about a hesychasm. That's what I recall on hesychasm. So he wrote on hesychasm and a sort of political theology that envisaged a very radical nationalism, fascism, and well, anti-Semitism, of course. And I would say that Krajnik is a very radical representative, but the most important radical representative of this Orthodox political theology of the 30s. There was another figure, Bishop Nikolai Velimirovich, who has become canonized by the Serbian Orthodox Church. He actually, his trajectory of his political theology, because he was a heavily involved political theologian. His trajectory reflected the evolution of the Orthodox political theology in the long 20th century. He started as a very pro-democratic, pro-liberal, liberal political theologian. Such were his writings in the 1910s, 1920s, and in his early writings he reflected basically the insights of the political theology of the 20s. He was coherent in a sense with the writings of Father Sergei Bulgakov and etc. But in the 30s, he aligned himself now with the more conservative trend, with this very conservative and sometimes even radical conservative political theology, to the point that he, well, praised Hitler, and his writings became really very nationalistic. And in this edition, at this stage, or this phase of his writings is very popular now in modern Serbia, for which reason he became canonized, I believe. So he kind of fluctuated together with the political theology, Orthodox political theology, from the 20s through the 30s, and when he eventually, after the World War II, went back to the United States, he again came back to some pro-democratic writings, and he also demonstrated that the political theology after the World War II changed its direction again. The World War II became a shock for Europe, it became a shock for the churches, and became a driving force for further development of the political theology. The political theology in the post-World War II era, let me show you this picture, became known as the political theology after Auschwitz. Because the original Western political theology articulated by Carl Schmitt had contributed to Nazism, there was a big debate in the West whether political theology should continue existing at all, because Carl Schmitt so much compromised it. That some people wanted to reject it altogether. But there were some people who said, look, we need to redeem this political theology, and the redemption could go only through the acknowledgement of the crimes and contribution of the churches and theologians to the crimes of Auschwitz and other Nazi crimes. That's how the Western political theology started developing as a political theology after Auschwitz. It became more liberal, more anti-dictatorial, anti-imperial, and valuing human agency and human freedom. But this happened in the West. In the East, we had our own tragedies, which did not lead us to Orthodox political theologies. Like we had, of course, the genocides, the Turkish genocides against the Orthodox populations of Syrians, the so-called Saifor, the Pontic Greeks, and of course the Armenians, the most tragic one. But this political theology did not really reflect, I mean, in Orthodoxy, in a broad sense, I believe Eastern Christianity, those tragedies were not really reflected theologically. They were reflected in culture, they were reflected in narratives, in literature, but not really in theology. In Ukraine, we had Holodomor, the massive famine, and even though many people managed to escape, Holodomor went to Canada, to the United States, to the Ukrainian diaspora, which became very powerful, strong in the Western Hemisphere. But even there, political theology, Orthodox political theology, did not really offer proper systematic reflections, political theological reflections in the way how the German political theologians like Moltmann, like Metz, like later liberation theologians reflected on the on Auschwitz and other tragedies of the Western world. Of course, you see to the left, I took this picture in Auschwitz, actually in Svensson. In the middle, it's a figure of a girl survivor of Holodomor, of the famine in Ukraine, and to the right it's a fragment, a picture I've taken at the mass grave in Bucha in Ukraine. And I hope that the present political theology, Orthodox political theology, should reflect, cannot develop otherwise but by reflecting on the tragedies like the massive killings of civilians in Bucha and elsewhere across Ukraine, as in a larger sense as a reflection on the Russian aggression in Ukraine. I cannot envisage a reliable, a respectable Orthodox political theology ignoring the Ukrainian war. So it is the must, kind of, it's a precondition sine qua non, as it were, for the political theology after the long 20th century. So let me use this opportunity to say that a new stage, I believe, of Orthodox political theology may begin, the 21st century political theology, that will have to reflect the tragedies that happened to the Orthodox populations, the wars, including the intra-Orthodox wars, something that did not happen in the 20th century. So the 20th century basically developed between those two poles of conservatism and liberalism, and reflected some Western patterns of theology, but never reflected really on the tragedies in the Orthodox places, in the Orthodox milieus. And I believe this century is over. I hope this century is over, and we will have to start to reflect on our own tragedies, like to develop political theology after Holodomor, after Bucha, and well, I hope there will be no more tragedies, but one never knows. And of course, speaking about Finland, I think in the Finnish context, also the occupation, the Russian occupation of the parts of Finland, the very fact that well, the Karelian population in Finland, which was Orthodox to a great extent, not all Karelians are Orthodox, of course, but many are, and even those tragedies need to be included in the new political theology, in the new 21st century, after this long 20th century theology, which was so silent about the tragedies that happened in our own lands. So I hope that the new political theology will include also reflections on what happened to Finland after the Winter War, and even maybe before the Winter War. Anyways, let me come back to the post-war political theology, and I should say that the theology of the 60s had its own towering figures. I would say that Sabas Agouridis, a professor from the University of Thessaloniki, was really an important figure. He was very radically anti-Byzantine in the sense that he was against all those attempts of a revival of Byzantinism by the Orthodox people. He stressed he was anti-Western. He was against the anti-Western attitude in the Orthodox political theology. He was also very vocal about human agency, human freedom, exactly in the spirit of Berdyaev and Florovsky and Bulgakov. Another place where this political theology of the 60s evolved was Institut de Theologie Orthodoxe Saint-Serge in Paris, which became a place where this new political theology was forged. And this political theology of the 60s envisaged emancipation, envisaged a kind of reconciliation with the society, and its own aggiornamento. In parallel to this emancipatory theology of the 60s, there were still some, or I would say, I would put like this. This spirit of aggiornamento had different manifestations and implications, more conservative and more liberal ones. There were still some conservative trends in the Orthodox political theology, and I believe they were amalgamated in the so-called brotherhoods that flourished in Greece. I mean primarily Zoe and Sotir. This is a picture from the book of Christos Yanaras, To Καταφύγιο Ιδιών, which is what I believe the best description of the brotherhoods. Yanaras himself was a part of the brotherhood and then descended from the brotherhood and became a critical voice against them. And those brotherhoods supported the dictatorships in Greece. There were several dictatorships even after the World War II, and the most important one was, of course, the dictatorship of the so-called Black Colonels, 1967 through 1974. This is a column of the members of the Brotherhood marching through Athens. It's quite a spirit of fascismo, in a sense. There were some figures who also contributed to the Orthodox political theology after the World War II, like Father John Romanidis. He actually participated. He had also a very active political life in addition to being a theologian and having a theological life. He participated in some political projects, for example, of restoring the legacy of the colonels after the dictatorship failed in 1974. He also came back with his renewed idea of Byzantinism, which he called Romeosini. Romeosini is nothing else but like an updated version of the old sort of Byzance après Byzance. So he had his own idea of Romeosini after Romeosini. After the original Romeosini in the Roman Empire, Eastern Roman Empire, he wanted to establish his own Romeosini in modern Greece, which was conservative, even dictatorial, I would say, and certainly in the spirit of the 30s, but it's an updated version. It's not really a 100% pure fascism of the 30s, but it was a more updated, more nuanced version of it based on patristics, based on theology. And I believe that there were some figures which concurred with him, like, for example, Panayotis Christou, a famous patrologist in Greece, and also Father George Mitalinos, whom I had as a professor in Athens, who was a disciple of Romanidis. They spoke about the same. Somehow, well, a key figure in the development of the Orthodox political theology was Christos Yanaras, whom I also had a chance to follow his lectures at the University of Pandion in Athens. You've heard of him, probably some of you met him. He was really a sweet person, a very talented thinker and theologian, and he represented a sort of he denied, as I said in the beginning, political theology altogether. He said that political theology is impossible. The Orthodox political theology is impossible because there is only a Western political theology. At the same time, he became a political theologian par excellence. He became really the most important political theologian of the 20th century, after Sergei Bulgakov maybe. And he, on the one hand, as I said, he descended from the brotherhoods. He condemned the kind of dictatorial spirit, the spirit of denial of human freedom and human agency. Yanaras celebrated human agency and human freedom in the most explicit and the most prominent way. And most of his books are dedicated to the human freedom and agency. At the same time, he represented a trend within the theology of the 60s, which became increasingly isolationist, anti-Western, and pro kind of Byzantine. He increasingly became exclusivist, an exclusivist theologian, excluding others from his ideal realm of God on earth, as it were. For him, only Byzantium represented such a kind of ideal society and relations between the church and the state and the citizens and power. And he wanted this kind of ideal quasi-Byzantine society to come back. He criticized modern Greece as not fitting this ideal. I personally heard him. We went together to Cappadocia in 2007 and we had a conversation. He told me personally that he believes that Turkey, modern Turkey, is more an embodiment of the spirit, of true political theology than even modern Greece. For this reason, for example, to a great dismay of many, including myself, he supported Vladimir Putin after even the annexation of Crimea in 2014. So he became quite a disappointment for many who admired him, especially in the wake of the Russian war against Ukraine. And he basically represented this trend within the theology of the 60s, which was emancipatory on the one hand. On the other hand, it was very exclusivist, anti-Western, leading to what we could call the civilization exceptionalism, praising a particular civilization which is believed to be Orthodox, and on the basis of being Orthodox, this civilization is regarded to be superior to other civilizations. That's what the Russian world is all about. The Russian world of Vladimir Putin and Patriarch Kirill Unyaev is all about this civilizational exceptionalism, and in this point they were coherent with Yanaras. Even though Yanaras, I know that some stories that, for example, already in the late period, not long before he died, he was approached to write a sort of article preface to a book about Russian world or whatever, and he was so critical about the Russian world in its later phase that they rejected this preface of him. Nevertheless, he publicly praised Putin, and this is a matter of fact, which is also, I think, which has damaged his reputation. Anyways, Yanaras represented also a sort of political theology of the 60s, which denied that there is such a thing as Orthodox political theology. A very similar figure could be seen as Father Alexander Schmemann. We know him as a theologian, as a liturgist, but he was also a political theologian. I think he was really a very important, a very and at the same time not so explicit political theologian. Just like Florovsky, he pretended to be apolitical, and yet he produced a very strong political theology. In the same way, Schmemann pretended to be apolitical, but he produced a very strong version of political theology, which was different from Florovsky's. Florovsky's was a very not very, but moderately conservative. Schmemann's was moderately liberal. In this sense, he represented the spirit of the 60s, the theology of the 60s, and at the same time, in contrast to Yanaras, his political theology was not exclusivist. It was more inclusivist. It was more embracing, others, the other, embracing the West, also the Western culture. And Schmemann, in this sense, represents a trend within the Orthodox political theology of the 60s, which, in contrast to Yanaras's trend, which was more exclusivist, Schmemann's trend was more inclusivist, was more about global values than about particular Eastern identities. He really hated even the idea of Eastern identity, which has become so crucial for Yanaras, for example. There is also a criticism of the exclusivist Orthodox political theology of the 60s, expressed by Pandelis Kalazidis, who who lives in Greece, in Volos. He's the director of the Volos Theological Academy. He's very critical of Yanaras and critical of this general trend of those attempts to build Byzance, après Byzance in our times. And I should end with another interesting case of political theologian, that is Patriarch Kirill of Moscow. I believe he is a very important political theologian indeed. He is an original thinker, original political theologian. I would say he is a father of the modern Russian political theology in many ways. Because I worked with him closely, I remember him really trying to switch from patristics, which was his original field, which he taught in the Leningradsk Theological Academy, to political theology and to make political theology relevant. Just like Yanaras, for example, Kirill was formed by the spirit of the 60s. He began as a very liberal thinking, open-minded hierarch and a political theologian. His sort of political theology was quite emancipatory, rather in the spirit of the 1920s and 1960s. He became a personalist, just like Yanaras or like John Zizioulas, for example. And he became a proponent of this personalistic attitude. He believes that a persona is more important than essence, and persona is more important in the East than it is in the West, while the West is essentialist, this kind of stuff. So his roots do not grow from the fascist political theologies of the sort of the 1930s. He never read, I assume, like people like Krajnik or never read other fascist theologians who were many of them in the 1930s. He read people like Losky, like Bulgakov, of course, and appreciated and enjoyed them. But then he became a proponent of this Russian world ideology, which is nothing else but a political theology. It's a sort of political theology. This political theology is exclusivist again, because it claims that the Russian civilization is superior to other civilizations. It has become very anti-Western, and we see how many commonalities there are between Yanaras and this kind of theology, because it's exclusivist, it's anti-Western. Kirill also values freedom to some extent, even though increasingly he values the freedom of himself. He believes that his freedom matters. Other freedoms they don't matter. In this regard, I believe he's very similar to Elon Musk, who also believes that his freedom is the most important thing and other freedoms are not so important. Kirill also marked a new symphonic relationship between the church and the state. So it's a kind of stepping back to the symphonic imperial models of political theology before Solovyov, before Berdiaev, and before Bulgakov. And in a sense, I believe Kirill's political theology amalgamates all sorts of political theology theologies that existed in the long 20th century. We can find the traces, ideas of Bulgakov in his writings. We can find traces of, again, Losky, of Florovsky, of Yanaras and others in his writings. So the entire spectrum of the Orthodox political theologies became forged in the theological writings and sayings of Patriarch Kirill. And of course we know where it ended up. It ended up here. I found this picture, this kind of cartoon, soon after a massive bombardment of Kiev recently, and it writes Russian world, and you see Patriarch Kirill just underneath Stalin and Putin in a head which has this like Z symbolism of the Russian operation. And this is unfortunately the end of the political theology as it evolved, at least some trends of the political theology from the long 20th century. This is the fiasco of these trends. This is the fiasco of the anti-Westernism, of exclusivism, of Byzantinism, of the attempts to build Byzance après Byzance, because Putin exactly tries to build a Byzance après Byzance in Russia, and this is one of the kind of driving forces of his dictatorship and his wars. So I think Kirill's political theology is a sort of the end of the long 20th century political theology. It doesn't mean that we need to discard the Orthodox political theology of the 20th century altogether. We shouldn't. It's still very valuable. I believe that the writings of Bulgakov, of Berdyaev, even of Solovyov, of Florovsky could and should be used in the 21st century. But we need to learn the bad lessons, the wrong lessons of the 20th century. We need to really to kind of analyze and to assess properly not just the ideas that were expressed in the 20th century, theological ideas, but also their realization, where they led, to which reality, political and social reality they led. We saw some ideas leading to really bad consequences. Let me go back to the slide where Kirill is next to Putin. And Kirill's personalism actually led to the personalistic rule of Putin, contributed to this rule. Personalism claims that persona is above the essence. In political terms, it means that the persona of a leader is above the laws, above the rules of the society. That's exactly the sort of personalistic rule of Putin. And we, by the way, we observe the same kind of tendency in the United States, even though on different premises. So also we've seen how Yanaras, who developed so beautiful theology, ended up in supporting Putin. That is, I think, another fiasco that needs to be analyzed and reassessed properly. And with this proper analysis and assessment, I think we can go further to developing our theology for the new century, 21st century. I think we, as Orthodox theologians, are very responsible for this theology, and I believe, let me go back to the slide I wanted to show you as the conclusion of my presentation. Yes, this one. This theology after Bucha, this theology after Holodomor, the theology after Saifor, after the genocides, theology after the Winter War in Finland, it needs to be also included into the new theology for the new 21st century. So let's get over this long 20th century. It was productive, it was interesting, it was creative, but it failed also in so many ways, including this recent war of Russia against Ukraine. Thank you for your attention.